By October 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte's conquest of Russia was crumbling. He had taken Moscow, but it was a ghost town, set ablaze and stripped of supplies. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate, and the brutal Russian winter was closing in. Trapped deep in enemy territory with a dwindling army, retreat wasn't just an option. It was a life-or-death necessity. The route Napoleon chose would seal the fate of his Grande Armée. The Battle of Maloyaroslavets, fought on October 24, 1812, is the moment where this campaign truly turned. On the surface, it was a hard-won victory for Napoleon's forces, but strategically, it was a disaster. It forced the emperor into a fatal decision, to abandon a retreat through the untouched, fertile south and instead turn back onto the desolate, ravaged path they had already taken. This choice condemned his army to destruction by starvation, frostbite, and relentless enemy attacks. Today, we'll explore how this single battle, and the decision made in its aftermath, transformed a difficult withdrawal into one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. On October 19th, the Grande Armée marched out of Moscow. It was a shadow of its former self, with around 90,000 exhausted infantry, 14,000 weak cavalry, and tens of thousands of non-combatants slowing them down. Napoleon had two choices: return the way they came, along the Moscow-Smolensk road, a path already stripped bare of all food and resources, or forge a new path southwest towards the city of Kaluga, through a region rich with supplies. This southern route offered a chance to feed his army and survive the long march home. But it also meant risking a confrontation with the main Russian army under Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov. Napoleon, ever the gambler, chose the southern route. His plan was to seize the provisions around Kaluga, preserve his army's strength, and execute a controlled withdrawal. This wasn't a desperate flight. It was a calculated maneuver to outwit his opponent. But Kutuzov was waiting, ready to turn Napoleon's gamble into a death trap. The clash at Maloyaroslavets was a battle of two radically different strategies. On one side, you have Napoleon, desperate to salvage his army and his reputation. He either needed to force a decisive battle to shatter the Russians, or execute a clean retreat through fertile lands. By marching towards Kaluga, he was threatening Kutuzov's flank, hoping to force the Russians to fall back and open the road south. It was a classic Napoleonic move, an attempt to dictate the terms of engagement even while retreating. On the other side was Field Marshal Kutuzov. His goal was simple: avoid a massive, pitched battle at all costs. He knew he didn't need to defeat Napoleon in a single, glorious fight. He just needed to steer him onto the barren northern route. There, the Russian winter, starvation, and constant harassment from Cossacks would do the work for him. Kutuzov was playing the long game. He famously told a British general who urged a more aggressive attack, "I am by no means sure that the total destruction of the Emperor Napoleon and his army would be such a benefit to the world." He feared that if Napoleon was completely wiped out, Britain, which already commanded the seas, would become too powerful. Kutuzov's primary objective was to expel the invaders and destroy their army with minimal Russian losses, not to hand victory to a rival empire. At Maloyaroslavets, these two clashing philosophies would collide head-on. The small town of Maloyaroslavets became the strategic choke point of the entire campaign. Its bridge over the Lusha River was the gateway to the south. For Napoleon, taking it was essential. For Kutuzov, holding it meant forcing the French onto the road to ruin. The race for the town was initially won by Napoleon's stepson, Prince Eugène de Beauharnais. On the evening of October 23rd, his troops seized the bridge and the town itself, but the Russians arrived overnight. At dawn, General Dokhturov launched a surprise counterattack, driving the small French force back towards the river. What followed on October 24th was a brutal street-by-street brawl for control of the burning town. The town reportedly changed hands up to 8 times. General Delzons, the very commander who had first captured it, was killed in the chaos. Prince Eugène threw more and more of his troops into the meat grinder. His Italian divisions fought with incredible ferocity. One Italian unit, the Royal Guard, fought so bravely that they were said to have earned their place amongst the bravest troops of Europe. By nightfall, the French and Italian forces had finally pushed the Russians out and held the smoldering ruins. They had won the tactical fight. But the strategic picture was bleak. The main Russian army under Kutuzov hadn't been defeated. It had simply pulled back to a series of heavily fortified hills just south of the town, completely blocking the road to Kaluga. Both sides had suffered horrendous casualties, with estimates of around 6,000 to 8,000 men killed or wounded on each side. Eugene's men held the battlefield, but Kutuzov held the road. The French had won the battle, but lost the way forward. The 24 hours after the fighting were even more decisive than the battle itself. Instead of risking another massive, bloody battle like Borodino, Kutuzov made a brilliant move. He ordered his army to pull back further south, still blocking the road but denying Napoleon the major engagement he might have been tempted to seek. On the morning of October 25th, as Napoleon himself was scouting the new Russian positions, he and his staff were nearly captured in a sudden Cossack raid. Only the quick action of his personal guard saved him. The shock of this near capture seems to have shattered his nerve. From that day on, he reportedly carried a small bag of poison around his neck, just in case. The man who had conquered Europe was now terrified of being taken prisoner. On October 26th, Napoleon held a war council with his marshals. The options were grim. They could press south and risk a catastrophic battle against a well-prepared enemy. They could try to find another route west, or they could retreat north, back along the barren, devastated path of their advance. After agonized deliberation, Napoleon made his choice. He ordered the army to turn north. It was a catastrophic failure of nerve, a decision that prioritized his own preservation over the audacious risks that had once defined him. This decision sealed the fate of the Grande Armée. The retreat had officially begun. The strategic consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Kutuzov had won. He had forced Napoleon onto the northern route, exactly as he had planned. First, this decision wasted a full week of clear autumn weather, precious time that the army could not get back as winter closed in. Second, the army was now marching through a wasteland, stripped of all food. Foraging was impossible. The soldiers began to starve. Third, in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, the new route forced the army to march back across the battlefield of Borodino. The horrific sight of tens of thousands of unburied, rotting corpses from the battle fought weeks earlier shattered what was left of the soldiers' morale. Finally, the order to retreat north sent a clear message to every man in the army. This was no longer a strategic withdrawal. It was a desperate, headlong flight. Discipline and cohesion evaporated. As the Grande Armée trudged north, Kutuzov didn't need to offer another major battle. He simply escorted the French column, using his Cossacks and partisans to relentlessly pick off stragglers, attack supply wagons, and bleed the French army dry every step of the way. Maloyaroslavets had maneuvered the Grande Armée into a death trap, from which there was no escape. In the end, the Battle of Maloyaroslavets is a perfect example of the difference between winning a fight and winning a war. Tactically, on the ground, Prince Eugene's soldiers fought with incredible courage and won control of the town. But this victory was strategically meaningless. Field Marshal Kutuzov won the campaign at Maloyaroslavets. By blocking Napoleon's path south, he forced the Grande Armée onto a road that guaranteed its destruction. He accomplished his main objective without having to risk his own army in another bloodbath. Napoleon's final decision, born of fear and an army on the brink of collapse, was the true, irreversible turning point of the 1812 invasion. It was the moment the greatest military genius of his age was strategically outmaneuvered, and the Grande Armée was condemned to its frozen grave. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this analysis interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into military history. We'll see you in the next one.